Karen didn't even slow down when she saw the sign. She marched straight across the freshly cut grass, stopped less than 3 feet from it, and read every word out loud with growing disbelief. Private property. No HOA authority beyond this point. Trespassers will be reported. She looked from the sign to me, then back again as if the message might somehow change. You cannot be serious, she said. I finished tightening the last bolt with a socket wrench before standing up. Morning, Karen. Don't morning me. She pointed at the sign. Take that down. I brushed a little dirt off my gloves and looked at the entrance road we'd both been staring at for years. Why? Because this is HOA property. Her answer came so quickly that it sounded rehearsed. No, I replied calmly. It isn't. That sentence stopped her for exactly 1 second. Then she laughed. Not because she thought I was funny, but because she genuinely believed I had no idea what I was talking about. Daniel, she said, folding her arms, I've been president of this association for 4 years. I know. We've maintained this entrance for decades. I know that too. She took another step toward me. Then you know you don't have the authority to install signs here. I glanced at the brass survey monument sticking out of the ground beside the road, only a few feet from where we were standing. It had been there longer than most of the houses in the neighborhood. Actually, I said, I do. Her expression hardened. 28 years earlier, when my wife and I bought this property, the subdivision next door hadn't even been built. Back then, the entrance was nothing more than a gravel road cutting through open pasture. The developer built the neighborhood years later, but my parcel was never included in the HOA. My land simply happened to sit beside their entrance. For a long time, that arrangement caused almost no problems. Then little things started happening. 15 years ago, landscapers showed up to plant decorative shrubs several feet onto my property. They apologized the moment I showed them the survey. 3 years later, another contractor prepared to trim cedar trees that belonged to me because his map placed them inside the HOA boundary. He stopped immediately after seeing the brass survey marker. Neither crew argued. They simply corrected the mistake and left. I always assumed those incidents were isolated. 3 weeks earlier, I discovered they weren't. I had been walking the property when I noticed bright orange paint across the grass and wooden stakes running along the entrance. Curious, I asked one of the contractors what they were building. New stone entrance wall, he answered cheerfully. Then he pointed directly across a strip of my land. Starts here. I didn't argue. I thanked him, went home, and spent the rest of that evening pulling every document from my filing cabinet. My deed, the original survey, county parcel records. I even drove to the courthouse the following morning just to make sure nothing had changed without my knowledge. It hadn't. The boundary was exactly where it had always been. Still, I caught myself wondering if I'd overlooked something. An easement, a boundary adjustment, a forgotten agreement from years ago. So I hired a licensed surveyor to verify everything one more time. When his report matched every document I already had, I ordered the sign. Not to provoke anyone, not to embarrass the HOA, simply to make whoever showed up with heavy equipment stop long enough to ask one important question: who actually owns this land? Karen wasn't interested in that question. She pulled out her phone instead. I'm giving you one opportunity to remove it voluntarily. I'm afraid I can't do that. Then I'll have it removed. You might want to verify the property line first. She shook her head. I don't need a survey to recognize HOA property. I looked once more at the brass monument quietly marking the boundary between assumption and fact. That's exactly what worries me. Karen tapped a number into her phone without taking her eyes off me. Sheriff's office, she said when someone answered. Yes, I'd like to report an unauthorized sign on HOA property. As she spoke, I felt the same small knot of uncertainty any reasonable person would feel. Even with every document in my folder, a tiny part of me wondered whether I'd missed something. But the survey marker hadn't moved. The county records hadn't changed. And within minutes, a deputy would arrive and ask one simple question that nobody standing there seemed eager to answer. Who actually owns the ground beneath that sign? Karen ended the call, slipped her phone back into her pocket, and looked at me with the confidence of someone who believed the conversation was already over. A deputy is on the way, she said. Good, I replied. I'd rather settle this with facts than opinions. She frowned, clearly expecting me to become nervous. Instead, I walked over to my pickup, opened the passenger door, and pulled out the same worn leather folder I'd carried to the courthouse a week earlier. I set it on the tailgate without opening it. There was no point arguing before anyone had even asked a question. Within minutes, the quiet Saturday morning began attracting attention. A jogger slowed to a walk. A couple walking their dog stopped across the street. The construction crew, who had been preparing equipment for the new entrance wall, quietly shut off their machines to see what was happening. One of the workers recognized me from the week before. "Everything okay, Mr. Harper?" he asked. "We'll find out soon enough," I answered. Karen folded her arms. "You might as well tell your contractors they're losing a day's work because of this sign." The foreman looked uncomfortable. "We're not starting until we know where the boundary is," he said carefully. Karen turned toward him. "The boundary is where it's always been." The foreman hesitated. "Ma'am, we build what the plans tell us. We don't determine property ownership." That answer seemed to irritate her even more. "The HOA approved those plans." "I'm sure they did," he replied politely. "But approval and ownership aren't always the same thing." Before Karen could respond, a patrol SUV rolled slowly into the entrance and stopped beside the road. Deputy Ryan Collins stepped out, adjusted his duty belt, and spent several seconds simply observing the scene before saying a single word. His eyes moved from my sign, to the orange construction stakes, to Karen, then finally to me. "Morning," he said. "Who called?" "I did," Karen answered immediately, walking toward him. "This gentleman installed an unauthorized sign on HOA property and refuses to remove it." Collins nodded once. "Okay." He looked at me. "Sir, Daniel Harper." "Mr. Harper, what's your understanding of the situation?" "The sign is on my property." Collins didn't react. He simply looked back at Karen. "And you believe it's on HOA property?" "Absolutely." "All right." He took out a small notebook. Then, before we discussed the sign, he paused and asked the one question I had been waiting to hear all morning. "Who owns the land?" Karen answered without hesitation. "The Homeowners Association." Collins nodded. "Do you have documentation showing that?" She blinked once. "We maintain the entrance." "I understand." He remained perfectly calm. "Maintenance records?" "Well, yes." "Ownership records?" Karen hesitated for the first time. "The board has always recognized this as HOA property." Collins wrote something in his notebook. "Recognition isn't the same as recorded ownership." He turned toward me. "Mr. Harper?" I picked up the leather folder, walked over, and handed it to him. "Everything I have is in there." He opened it carefully. On top sat the recorded deed. Beneath it was the certified survey. Then county parcel maps, tax records, and photographs of the brass survey monument taken only days earlier by the surveyor. Collins didn't flip through them quickly. He examined each page one at a time, comparing legal descriptions, parcel numbers, and survey references with the kind of patience that comes from knowing small details often matter most. Standing there watching him, I felt a brief wave of uncertainty despite everything I'd already verified. What if there was an easement I hadn't considered? What if the developer had recorded something decades ago that I hadn't found? I reminded myself why I'd hired the surveyor in the first place. If I'd missed something, surely he would have found it. Collins closed the folder for a moment and looked toward the brass survey monument beside the road. "Is that the marker referenced here?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. "Mind if we take a look?" We walked over together. He knelt beside the monument, brushed away a little loose dirt with his glove, and compared the stamped identification number against the survey documents. Then he stood, took out his phone, and accessed the county GIS records. For nearly a minute, nobody spoke. Even Karen remained unusually quiet as Collins compared the digital parcel map with the documents in my folder. Finally, he zoomed in, frowned slightly, and opened another county record. Then another. His expression didn't suggest confusion anymore. It suggested curiosity. "Interesting," he murmured. Richard Evans, the HOA vice president, pulled into the parking lot just then after receiving Karen's call. He hurried over, still carrying the familiar blue maintenance binder every board member seemed to rely on. "Sorry I'm late," he said. "What's going on?" Collins looked up from his phone. "Maybe you can help me answer a question." Richard nodded. "Sure." Collins held up the binder. "Does that contain records showing the HOA owns this land?" Richard opened it confidently, flipping through maintenance contracts, landscaping schedules, irrigation diagrams, and entrance improvement plans. The confidence on his face slowly faded. He looked at Karen, then back at the binder. "These are maintenance records." Collins nodded. "That's what I thought." He closed my folder and looked toward both board members. Because according to the recorded deed, the certified survey, the county parcel records, and the survey monument sitting right here. He paused before finishing the sentence. This sign appears to be standing exactly where Mr. Harper says it is. But before I reach any conclusions, there's one document I'd still like to see. The original subdivision plat. If that says what I think it does, this conversation is about to become a lot bigger than a sign. Richard looked genuinely puzzled. The original subdivision plat, he repeated. Deputy Collins nodded. The one recorded when the neighborhood was first developed. Richard glanced at Karen. I don't keep that in the maintenance binder. Karen answered before he could say anything else. We don't need 30-year-old paperwork. We already know where the entrance is. Collins didn't argue. He simply asked another question. Do you know where the original documents are kept? Karen hesitated. Probably somewhere in the clubhouse archives. Richard scratched the back of his neck. Linda has the records room keys. Collins slipped his notebook back into his pocket. Then I'd like to see those records before anyone removes this sign or starts construction. Karen sighed with obvious frustration. Deputy, with all due respect, we're talking about a neighborhood entrance. Actually, Collins replied, we're talking about property ownership. That's a little different. A few homeowners quietly nodded. The construction foreman crossed his arms but stayed out of the conversation. He'd clearly decided he wasn't moving another piece of equipment until someone answered Collins' questions. Karen turned toward me again. Daniel, you've lived next to us for years. You know we've maintained this entrance forever. Yes. Then why wait until now to make an issue out of it? Because shrubs can be replanted. She frowned. What? I pointed toward the orange stakes marking the future stone wall. Shrubs can be moved. Concrete walls are harder to relocate. That answer earned a small chuckle from one of the contractors. Karen shot him a look that immediately erased his smile. Collins looked back at my survey. Mr. Harper, have you ever disputed this boundary before today? Not formally. Why not? Because every previous mistake stopped before permanent damage was done. He looked interested. Tell me about that. I nodded toward the entrance landscaping. About 15 years ago, a landscaping company showed up with dozens of decorative shrubs. The memory was still clear. The crew had unloaded half their trailer before I noticed they were digging holes several feet onto my property. Their supervisor confidently unfolded a site plan showing the entire strip as HOA land. I walked him to the brass survey monument. He stared at it, looked back at his drawing, then quietly told his crew to refill every hole they'd already dug. Before leaving, he apologized twice and admitted he'd simply trusted the map he had been given. Collins scribbled a few notes. Anything else? 3 years later, another contractor planned to trim several cedar trees. Susan, who had been listening from the sidewalk, looked surprised. The ones by your driveway? Those are the ones. I nodded. Their map showed those trees inside the HOA boundary too. The construction foreman looked at me. Did they cut them? No. Why not? Because they checked the survey marker before starting. He let out a slow whistle. Smart foreman. Very. Collins looked toward Karen. Were you on the board during either of those incidents? She shook her head. No. Richard answered instead. Neither of us was. Collins nodded thoughtfully. Then it's possible everyone simply inherited the same information. Karen immediately seized on that. Exactly. She looked around at the growing crowd. Every board has relied on the same maps for years. If every previous board accepted them, why wouldn't we? Collins answered in the same calm tone he'd used all morning. Because property ownership isn't established by repetition. Nobody said anything after that. The sentence seemed to settle over the entire group. Just then another SUV pulled into the clubhouse parking lot. Linda Brooks stepped out carrying a ring of keys nearly the size of her hand. She looked from the deputy to Karen to the small crowd gathered around the entrance. Did I miss something? Richard walked over. We need access to the archive room. Linda frowned. Why? Deputy Collins wants the original subdivision records. She looked genuinely confused. Nobody's asked for those in years. Today's different, Collins replied. Linda unlocked the clubhouse and disappeared inside with Richard close behind. Karen remained outside, tapping her foot against the pavement while watching them through the clubhouse windows. For the first time all morning, she didn't seem angry as much as impatient. She wanted the old records to prove her right so everyone could go home. Standing beside my truck, I realized I wanted exactly the same thing. Not because I wanted Karen to lose, but because a tiny voice in the back of my mind still wondered whether there might be some forgotten document none of us had seen before. I trusted my deed. I trusted the survey. I trusted the county records. Even so, certainty has a way of becoming quieter when everyone around you insists you're wrong. Collins must have noticed the expression on my face. "You all right?" he asked quietly. I nodded. "I think so. You don't sound convinced." I looked toward the clubhouse. "If those original records say something different." I shrugged. "Then I'd rather know today than spend the next 10 years believing I was right." Collins gave a small nod of approval. "That's probably the most reasonable thing anyone said all morning." Nearly 10 minutes passed before the clubhouse door finally opened. Richard stepped outside first, carrying a dusty cardboard archive box with both hands. Linda followed behind him with 2 large rolls of yellowed paper tucked beneath one arm and several faded file folders stacked against her chest. Dust covered nearly everything they carried. Richard set the heavy box on the hood of his truck with a dull thud and looked at Collins. "I think we found what you've been asking for." Collins stepped forward, carefully untied one of the rolled documents, and slowly spread the yellowed paper across the truck hood. The moment his eyes reached the property boundary, his expression changed. He didn't say a word. He simply looked over at Karen, then back down at the original plat, as if he had just found the first crack in a story everyone had believed for decades. Deputy Collins didn't touch the map for several seconds. He simply leaned over the hood of Richard's truck, studying the faded survey lines with the same patience he'd shown all morning. The paper had yellowed with age, and the corners were brittle enough that Linda held them flat with both hands to keep the breeze from rolling it back up. Around us, nobody spoke. Even Karen stopped pacing. She folded her arms and waited, clearly expecting the original plat to prove what she believed all along. Collins traced one boundary with his finger, then looked down at my certified survey. He returned to the original plat, comparing measurements one section at a time. After nearly a minute, he frowned, not because something didn't make sense, but because something suddenly did. Richard noticed the change immediately. "Deputy." Collins didn't answer. Instead, he pointed toward a survey line running beside the subdivision entrance. "Mr. Evans, is this the original recorded plat filed with the county?" Richard nodded. "As far as I know, yes." "Has anyone altered it?" "No." "Made a corrected version?" "Not that I'm aware of." Collins nodded once and looked toward the blue maintenance binder Richard had brought earlier. "Would you mind opening your entrance map again?" Richard placed the binder beside the original plat and unfolded the laminated maintenance drawing the board had been using for years. At first glance, the 2 maps appeared almost identical. The entrance road matched. The landscaped island matched. The sidewalks, irrigation lines, and decorative lighting all lined up. Karen looked relieved. "See," she said confidently. "They're the same." Collins didn't respond. Instead, he slid both maps closer together until the property boundaries were directly beside each other. Then he rested one finger on the original plat and another on the maintenance map. "Actually," he said quietly, "they're not." Richard leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Collins slowly traced the subdivision boundary on the original document. "According to the recorded plat, this property line stays here." He moved his finger to the maintenance map. "But on this copy," he stopped. "The boundary has shifted." Linda bent down until her face was only inches above the drawings. "Shifted?" Collins nodded. "Approximately 30 feet. Karen immediately shook her head. "That's impossible." Collins looked at her calmly. "Then come look." She stepped closer, still convinced there had to be another explanation. Collins pointed to a fixed survey monument shown on both maps. "This reference point hasn't moved." Then he pointed to the entrance road. "Neither has this." Finally, he traced the property boundary on each drawing. Only one line changed. Karen stared silently. Richard's eyes widened as he followed Collins' finger across both maps. The difference was unmistakable once someone showed you where to look. The maintenance map quietly pushed the boundary outward, transforming a strip of my property into HOA land without changing anything else around it. Linda blinked twice before whispering, "How did we never notice that?" Collins answered without looking up, "Because nobody was comparing them side by side." Susan stepped closer from the edge of the crowd. "So the maintenance map is wrong?" Collins chose his words carefully. "I'm saying the maintenance map doesn't match the recorded subdivision plat." Michael scratched his head. Could the county plat be outdated? Collins shook his head. Only if ownership changed afterward. Karen immediately looked at Richard. Maybe it did. Richard nodded uncertainly. There could have been a property transfer. Collins looked back into the archive box. If there was, there should be documentation. Linda immediately began sorting through the remaining folders. This time nobody rushed. Every envelope was opened. Every engineering sketch was checked. Every handwritten note was examined before being set aside. 10 quiet minutes passed. The construction crew remained exactly where they were, watching from beside their equipment. No one even started an engine. Finally, Linda pulled out a thin green folder covered in dust. She wiped the label with her sleeve until faded handwriting became visible. Richard, she said softly. He looked over. The tab read, Entrance Project Correspondence. Richard frowned. I've never seen that before. Neither have I. Collins held out his hand. May I? Linda passed him the folder. Most of the papers inside were ordinary contractor invoices and landscaping notes. Then Collins stopped. Tucked inside the back cover was a sealed envelope that looked as though it had never been opened. Across the front, written in fading blue ink, were 6 simple words. Keep with original entrance records. Richard stared at it in disbelief. That shouldn't still be sealed. Collins carefully opened the envelope along one edge and unfolded a single typewritten letter with a hand-drawn sketch attached to it. He read the first paragraph once, then started over and read it again more slowly. The expression on his face changed from curiosity to certainty. Richard noticed immediately. Deputy, he asked quietly. What did you just find? Collins looked up from the letter, then across the small crowd that had gathered around the truck. I think, he said, folding the page open so everyone could see the attached sketch. We're about to find out why every HOA board has been relying on the wrong property line for nearly 30 years. Deputy Collins unfolded the yellowed letter as carefully as if it were evidence in a courtroom. The paper crackled softly in the morning breeze. Around the truck, every conversation stopped. Even the construction crew drifted a few steps closer without saying a word. Collins read silently for nearly 30 seconds, then flipped to the attached sketch. He studied the drawing, compared it to the original subdivision plat, and finally looked toward Richard. I think you should read this yourself. Richard accepted the letter, adjusting his glasses before scanning the first paragraph. His expression stayed neutral at first, then his eyes slowed. By the time he reached the handwritten note near the bottom of the page, the color had begun draining from his face. You've got to be kidding me, he whispered. Karen reached for the paper almost immediately. Richard. He didn't move. Richard. He finally handed it over. Karen skimmed through the opening paragraph with obvious confidence, but that confidence faded sentence by sentence. She stopped halfway, went back, and read the same paragraph again. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody needed to. Collins waited until she lowered the page before speaking. That letter was written by the original subdivision developer to the engineering contractor responsible for building the entrance. He pointed toward the middle of the document. It specifically instructs them to keep every permanent improvement inside subdivision property unless the neighboring parcel is legally purchased. He then unfolded the attached sketch and laid it beside the original plat. The drawing wasn't complicated. It showed the entrance road, the survey monument, and the subdivision boundary. One thick black arrow pointed beyond the line toward my property. Beside it, written in bold block letters, were 7 words that everyone standing around the truck could easily read. Private parcel. Do not cross survey line. Susan covered her mouth. Oh my God. Michael leaned closer. That note has been sitting in a filing cabinet all these years. Linda slowly nodded. Apparently. Richard rubbed his forehead. Nobody ever opened the envelope. Karen remained completely still. She stared at the handwritten warning as though hoping another sentence might suddenly appear underneath it explaining everything away. It didn't. Collins gently tapped the original plat. This matches Mr. Harper's deed. Then he tapped my certified survey. This matches the county records. Finally, he tapped the developer's sketch. And this confirms the original construction instructions. He looked toward Karen. 3 independent records. Same property line. Karen swallowed but didn't answer. Collins wasn't finished. Now I'd like to know where this maintenance map came from. Richard immediately opened the blue binder again. It's been in our records as long as I can remember. Do you know who prepared it? Richard flipped through the first few pages until he reached the title block in the lower corner. He frowned. Wait. Linda leaned over his shoulder. What is it? Richard pointed to a small line of print almost hidden beneath a revision stamp. This isn't an engineering drawing. Collins stepped closer. What is it? Richard read the notation aloud. Landscape maintenance reference copy. Not for boundary determination. Nobody spoke. Collins held out his hand. May I? Richard passed him the map. Collins looked at the disclaimer for several seconds before slowly turning it toward Karen. Did you know this was printed here? Karen looked at the corner of the page. Her eyes widened. No. Has anyone on the board ever mentioned it? No. Collins nodded. Because if someone had. He looked around at the crowd. We probably wouldn't be standing here today. A low murmur spread through the homeowners. Several people stepped closer just to read the tiny disclaimer for themselves. It had always been there, printed in small letters, hidden beneath years of photocopies, lamination, and assumptions. Susan shook her head in disbelief. So everyone thought this was an ownership map. When it was only meant to tell landscapers where to mow and where to plant, Linda finished quietly. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. Every board inherited the wrong document. Collins corrected him gently. Not exactly. Richard looked up. What do you mean? Collins held up both maps side by side. You inherited the correct document. He lifted the original recorded plat and the convenience copy. Then he held up the maintenance map. Over time, people stopped checking one. He lowered the original plat onto the truck hood and started trusting the other. That sentence seemed to hit everyone harder than anything else Collins had said all morning. Nobody had intentionally claimed my property. Nobody had forged documents. Nobody had tried to steal land. They had simply trusted the wrong piece of paper for so many years that it slowly became accepted as fact. Karen finally broke the silence. Her voice was much quieter than it had been an hour earlier. We almost built a permanent wall. She looked toward the orange construction stakes. Using a map that literally says not to use it for property boundaries. Collins nodded once. Yes. The construction foreman let out a slow breath. If your sign hadn't stopped us. He glanced toward the excavator parked only yards away. My crew would have started digging this morning. Richard looked toward me for the first time since opening the envelope. There was no frustration left on his face. Only realization. Daniel, he said quietly. You weren't trying to stop our project. I shook my head. I was trying to stop a mistake. Richard slowly turned back toward the old developer's letter lying on the truck. Then I think, he said, almost to himself, our biggest problem today isn't that your sign went up. He looked around at every homeowner standing there before finishing the sentence. It's that we nearly ignored the only person who noticed we'd been trusting the wrong map for nearly 30 years. The realization settled over the group far more heavily than any accusation could have. Nobody argued. Nobody defended the maintenance map anymore. They simply stared at the two documents lying side by side on the hood of Richard's truck. The original recorded plat and the convenience copy that had quietly rewritten the property line in everyone's mind. Deputy Collins carefully stacked the papers together before looking around at the small crowd. At this point, he said, I'm satisfied that Mr. Harper's sign is standing on his property. He closed my leather folder and handed it back to me. As long as the sign complies with county regulations, there's no legal basis for requiring him to remove it. Karen didn't answer immediately. She looked across the road at the sign she'd demanded be taken down less than an hour earlier. The words hadn't changed. Only her understanding of them had. Richard finally broke the silence. The construction project is suspended. The foreman nodded before he even finished the sentence. Already done. He held up his phone. I called the office while everyone was reading the documents. Nobody's digging until we receive corrected plans. Richard looked relieved. Thank you. Don't thank me, the foreman replied. Thank Mr. Harper. Everyone turned toward me again. The foreman shrugged. He's the reason we caught this before the concrete trucks showed up. One of the younger workers scratched his head. Out of curiosity, how much trouble would we have been in if we'd built the wall? The foreman gave a short laugh. Enough that I'd rather not find out. Collins answered more directly. If permanent improvements had crossed onto private property, somebody would have been paying to remove them. The HOA, one homeowner asked. Collins chose his words carefully. Potentially the association. Potentially contractors. Potentially insurance companies. It depends on a lot of facts. He looked toward the unfinished entrance. The important thing is that nobody has to answer those questions now. Susan folded her arms. So one sign probably saved everyone months of headaches. Possibly years, Collins replied. Linda quietly picked up the maintenance map again. This time she noticed details she'd never paid attention to before. Colored irrigation notes, planting symbols, utility markings. Then, in the lower corner, the tiny disclaimer they'd all overlooked for decades. She slowly shook her head. It was telling us the truth the entire time. Michael frowned. What do you mean? She tapped the disclaimer with one finger. Not for boundary determination. She smiled bitterly. The map literally warned us not to use it this way. Richard let out a long breath. And every board after the first one ignored that warning without realizing it. Karen looked genuinely troubled now. Not defensive, not angry, just disappointed in herself. I should have checked the original records. Collins didn't criticize her. Most people trust the files they're handed. That's not an excuse, she replied quietly. No, Collins agreed. But it is an explanation. Karen looked over at me. When you told me to verify the property line. She paused for a moment. I thought you were challenging my authority. I wasn't. I know that now. Another long silence followed. It wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt more like the moment after finishing a difficult conversation that should have happened years earlier. Richard suddenly looked toward Linda. How many other projects have we approved using this maintenance map? Linda thought about it. Landscaping. Anything permanent. She hesitated. A few light poles, irrigation upgrades, flower beds. Richard looked at Collins. Do we need to inspect everything? Collins answered honestly. I would. Richard nodded immediately. Then that's exactly what we'll do. Susan raised an eyebrow. You're going to resurvey the whole entrance? Richard looked around at the homeowners. After today, he smiled faintly. I'd rather spend a weekend verifying everything than spend the next 10 years wondering what else we assumed. Several homeowners quietly nodded in agreement. Nobody complained about the extra work. They had all seen how close the neighborhood had come to making a very expensive mistake. Linda reached into the archive box and carefully placed the developer's letter back inside its envelope. This time, instead of sealing it, she slipped a bright yellow note on top that read, "Read before any entrance project." Richard noticed and smiled. Nobody's overlooking that again. Not if I can help it, Linda answered. Collins checked the time on his watch before closing his notebook. I think we've accomplished everything we needed to accomplish today. Karen looked surprised. You're leaving? Collins nodded. There's no crime here. He glanced toward me. Just a property owner protecting his land. Then he looked at the board members. And an association correcting a mistake before it became one. Before walking back to his patrol SUV, he stopped beside my sign one last time. He read it silently, then looked down at the brass survey monument sitting quietly in the grass only a few feet away. Funny thing, he said with a small smile. Everyone kept looking at the sign. He tapped the metal survey marker lightly with the toe of his boot. Turns out this little piece of brass had been giving everyone the right answer for nearly 30 years. Nobody laughed. They simply looked down at the monument, almost embarrassed that something so small had quietly outlasted assumptions, board meetings, contractor maps, and decades of misplaced confidence. As Collins climbed into his patrol SUV and drove away, Richard turned toward the homeowners who had gathered along the entrance. I'd like everyone to come to the clubhouse this evening, he said. There's something the entire neighborhood deserves to hear directly from the board. Karen looked at him, then slowly nodded. And this time, she added, glancing briefly in my direction, we're bringing the original records with us. By 6 o'clock that evening, the clubhouse parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Cars lined both sides of the street, and homeowners who usually skipped board meetings were walking through the front doors carrying folding chairs from their garages because every seat inside had already been taken. Rumors had spread through the neighborhood all afternoon. Some people believed I'd tried to stop the entrance renovation. Others had heard the sheriff's office shut the project down. A few were convinced the HOA had already been sued. Nobody seemed to know the truth. Richard stood at the front of the room with a stack of documents beside him. Linda arranged the original subdivision plat, the maintenance map, the developer's letter, and my certified survey where everyone could see them. Karen sat quietly at the board table, reading over her notes without saying a word. She looked nothing like the woman who had ordered me to remove my sign that morning. Richard tapped the microphone once. "I'd like to call this emergency meeting to order." The room slowly became quiet. Today's entrance construction project uncovered information that affects every homeowner in this association. He paused, looking around the crowded room. "Before rumors replace facts, we want everyone to hear exactly what happened." A man in the second row immediately raised his hand. "Is it true the HOA doesn't own the entrance anymore?" Richard shook his head. "No." A woman near the back spoke before he could continue. "Did someone sell part of it?" "No." Another voice came from the side of the room. "Are we getting sued?" Richard answered just as calmly. "No." The question stopped. "What happened," Richard continued, "is that we discovered the board has been relying on the wrong reference map for many years." A wave of whispers spread across the room. Linda stepped forward holding up the laminated maintenance map. "This document has been passed from one board to the next." Then she lifted the original recorded plat. "Unfortunately, this one stopped being consulted." She laid both maps side by side on the table beneath a document camera, so they appeared on the large screen behind her. Gasps quietly rippled through the audience as she highlighted the shifted property line. Even homeowners sitting in the back could immediately see the difference. "That can't be right," someone whispered. "It isn't," Linda replied. "That's exactly the problem." Richard looked toward Deputy Collins, who had agreed to attend the meeting before ending his shift. Collins walked to the front without any dramatic introduction. "I'm not representing the Homeowners Association." He looked toward me for a brief moment. "And I'm not representing Mr. Harper." He rested one hand on the table. "I'm simply explaining what I verified today." He held up my deed. "Recorded ownership. Then the certified survey. Licensed verification. Then the original subdivision plat. County filing. Finally, he unfolded the developer's letter. Original construction instructions." He placed them back onto the table one at a time. All 4 documents identify the same property boundary. The room became completely silent. Karen slowly stood from her chair. Several homeowners immediately turned toward her. Everyone expected an argument. Instead, she surprised them. "This morning," she began, "I believe Mr. Harper had installed an unauthorized sign on association property." She took a slow breath. "The evidence proved I was wrong." The room remained silent. Karen looked toward me. "Daniel." She hesitated only for a second. "I owe you an apology." Every eye in the clubhouse shifted toward me. Before I could answer, a homeowner in the front row stood up. "Wait a minute." Richard looked at him. "Yes. If Daniel hadn't put that sign up." He pointed toward the entrance outside. "Would we have built that wall on his property?" Nobody answered immediately. Collins finally broke the silence. "Based on the construction layout that existed Saturday morning." He glanced toward the revised plans on the table. "Yes." Another homeowner slowly lowered her glasses. "So we'd have had to tear the wall back down?" The construction foreman, who had come to the meeting after work, stood from the back row. "If we'd poured footings across the property line." He shrugged. "There's a very good chance we'd have been removing them later." A murmur spread across the room. One older homeowner shook his head. "That would have cost a fortune." Another quietly added, "And probably a lawsuit." Richard nodded. "Exactly." He looked directly toward me. "Which is why the board wants the official record to reflect something very important." Linda handed him a prepared resolution. Richard read it aloud. "The board acknowledges that construction was halted because neighboring property owner Daniel Harper questioned the boundary before permanent improvements began. Subsequent verification confirmed his concern was correct." He lowered the paper. "The association recognizes that his actions prevented construction beyond the subdivision's legal boundary." For a moment, nobody said anything. Then, unexpectedly, the same homeowner who had asked about the wall began clapping. One pair of hands became 3. 3 became 10. Within seconds, nearly the entire room was applauding. I felt more uncomfortable than proud. I stood and raised one hand. The applause slowly faded. "I appreciate that," I said. "But I wasn't trying to prove the board wrong." I looked around the room. I was trying to make sure the survey was right before someone poured concrete. A woman near the back smiled. "That's exactly why we're clapping." Soft laughter filled the room. Even Karen smiled. Richard waited until the room settled again before speaking one final time. "Tonight the board is adopting 3 new policies." He held up the resolution. "First, every future construction project affecting a property boundary must include the original recorded subdivision plat. He raised a second finger. Second, contractors must physically verify survey monuments before work begins. Then a third. And finally, the maintenance map we've relied on for years will remain in our archives permanently stamped, not for boundary determination, so no future board repeats our mistake. Every board member voted in favor without a single dissenting vote. As the meeting came to a close, homeowners gathered around the display table instead of rushing for the exit. They weren't studying my survey anymore. They were reading the tiny disclaimer hidden on the maintenance map, the one that had quietly warned every board for decades not to use it to determine ownership. More than one person simply shook their head in disbelief. The greatest surprise of the day wasn't that the property line had always been correct. It was that the truth had been sitting in the clubhouse all along, waiting for someone to open the right envelope before the wrong wall was built. The meeting should have ended there, but nobody seemed interested in leaving. Small groups formed around the clubhouse, each one having the same conversation in different words. Some homeowners studied the original subdivision plat. Others passed around copies of the developer's letter. The construction foreman stood with several contractors explaining how close they had come to digging the first footing that morning. The atmosphere wasn't angry anymore. It was reflective. People weren't trying to decide who to blame. They were trying to understand how an entire neighborhood had believed the wrong map for so many years. Richard finally walked over to me carrying a thick folder. "Daniel," he said, "before everyone heads home, would you do me one favor?" "What's that?" He opened the folder and spread a fresh set of construction drawings across a folding table. "These are the revised plans our engineer finished this afternoon." I looked down at them. The entrance wall had been pulled completely inside the subdivision boundary. The irrigation lines had been relocated. The decorative lighting had shifted several feet. Every permanent improvement now respected the survey line. Richard smiled awkwardly. "I'd sleep better if you looked at them too." I laughed. "You're asking the neighbor you argued with this morning?" He smiled back. "I'm asking the neighbor who caught what we missed." I studied the plans carefully, tracing the property line against the measurements I'd memorized years ago. Nothing crossed onto my parcel anymore. Even the landscaping beds had been redesigned to leave a comfortable buffer beside the survey monument. I handed the plans back. "These look right." Richard let out a breath. "That's the best news I've heard all day." Linda walked over carrying a single-page checklist. "There's one more thing." She handed it to the construction foreman. Across the top, in bold capital letters, were the words, "Boundary verification required before construction." Below the title was a short list. Confirm recorded plat. Locate survey monuments. Compare certified survey. Photograph markers before excavation. Obtain written approval. The foreman smiled as he read it. "Honestly," he said, "every project should start like this." Richard nodded. "From now on, ours will." Karen had remained near the edge of the parking lot talking quietly with several homeowners. After a few minutes, she walked toward us holding the notebook she'd used during the board meeting. "I'd like everyone's attention for one more minute." The conversations slowly faded. She opened the notebook and looked around at the crowd. "Before anyone goes home, I want to read the final paragraph that will appear in tonight's official meeting minutes." She took a slow breath. "The board acknowledges that neighboring property owner Daniel Harper acted within his legal rights when he installed a boundary notice on his property. The notice prompted a review of original records, resulting in the discovery of an inaccurate maintenance reference map before permanent construction began. The association recognizes that this review prevented improvements beyond its legal boundary and avoided significant future expense." She closed the notebook. "Those words will become part of the permanent record." No one spoke for a moment. Then Susan smiled. "That's exactly how it should be." Several homeowners quietly nodded in agreement. Just then the construction foreman raised his hand. "I'd like to say something too." Richard motioned for him to continue. The foreman looked around at everyone gathered in the parking lot. "I've been building subdivision entrances for almost 20 years. He paused. "Most disputes start after concrete gets poured." A few contractors behind him nodded. This one stopped before a single shovel hit the ground. He looked directly at me. "Mr. Harper, your sign didn't delay our project." He pointed toward the revised plans under Richard's arm. "It saved it." The words landed differently coming from someone with nothing to gain by saying them. Michael quietly shook his head. "Never thought I'd hear a contractor thank someone for stopping construction." Laughter spread through the crowd. Even Karen smiled. Richard handed the revised plans back to the foreman. You'll have updated survey stakes first thing Monday morning. Already scheduled, the foreman replied. And every member of my crew knows exactly why. Linda disappeared into the clubhouse for a moment before returning with the old laminated maintenance map. This time a bright red stamp covered nearly the entire front page. Obsolete, not for boundary determination. She held it up where everyone could see it. We're not throwing this away, she said. We're preserving it. A homeowner looked surprised. Why keep something that's wrong? Linda smiled faintly. Because mistakes become dangerous when people forget how they happened. She slipped the map into a clear archival sleeve beside the original developer's letter. The next board won't have to learn this lesson the hard way. As people slowly began returning to their cars, Deputy Collins pulled back into the parking lot one final time before ending his shift. Richard walked over and handed him the revised construction plans. Collins reviewed them beside the original recorded plat, comparing measurements one last time. After several moments, he closed the folder and handed it back. Looks good. Richard smiled. Coming from you, that means a lot. Collins glanced toward the entrance where my warning sign still stood beside the brass survey monument. You know what I keep thinking about? Richard shook his head. Collins pointed toward the sign. This morning, everyone thought that sign was the problem. Then he pointed toward the corrected plans in Richard's hands. Turns out it was the solution. Richard followed his gaze toward the entrance and smiled. No. Collins looked at him. Richard shook his head gently. The solution wasn't the sign. He looked around at the homeowners talking peacefully beneath the parking lot lights. The solution was finally asking the question nobody had bothered to ask in nearly 30 years. Collins nodded slowly. Fair enough. As I drove home that evening, I passed the entrance one more time. The orange construction stakes had already been pulled from the ground. Fresh survey flags now marked the corrected boundary instead. My sign remained exactly where I'd installed it. It no longer looked like a challenge. It looked like a reminder. And by Monday morning, an entire neighborhood would be building the right project in the right place for the very first time. Monday morning arrived with none of the tension that had filled the neighborhood 2 days earlier. Instead of flashing patrol lights and heated arguments, the entrance was surrounded by survey flags, measuring equipment, and contractors carefully locating every brass monument before unloading a single piece of machinery. The revised construction plans rested on the hood of the foreman's truck beside the original subdivision plat. Before anyone climbed into an excavator, the foreman gathered his crew. Same reminder as always, he said, holding up the new checklist. No digging until every survey marker matches the recorded plat. One of the younger workers glanced toward my warning sign, standing quietly beyond the entrance. So that's the sign everyone keeps talking about? The foreman smiled. That's the one. He looked around at the crew. Remember this job? It taught every one of us something. The worker laughed. That HOA meetings are dangerous? A few people chuckled. The foreman shook his head. No, that property lines don't care what anybody assumes. The crew nodded before spreading out with measuring tapes instead of shovels. From my driveway, I watched them locate the brass survey monument first. Only after the foreman personally confirmed every measurement did he give a simple nod. All right, he called. Now we build. There was something satisfying about hearing those words. Not because construction had finally started, but because it was finally starting in the right place. Around mid-morning, there was another knock on my front door. When I opened it, Karen stood there alone. She wasn't carrying a binder, a stack of bylaws, or a clipboard. Instead, she held a small bakery box and 2 cups of coffee. She smiled awkwardly. I figured we deserved a conversation that didn't involve deputies. I laughed. That's probably true. We sat on the porch overlooking the entrance while the contractors worked in the distance. For several minutes, neither of us said much. The sound of equipment echoed across the road, but every machine stayed comfortably inside the corrected boundary. Finally, Karen broke the silence. Can I ask you something? Sure. When you put that sign up, she looked toward it. Were you angry? I thought about the question before answering. No. She looked surprised. Not even a little. Honestly, I smiled. I was more worried than angry. Worried about what? That nobody would stop long enough to ask who owned the land. She stared quietly at her coffee for a few seconds. I wish I'd asked that question first. So do I. She nodded slowly. Instead, I asked who had the authority. I looked toward the survey monument beside the road. Authority changes every election. Then I pointed toward the brass marker. That doesn't. Karen laughed softly and shook her head. I'm going to remember that sentence for a long time. Before leaving, she reached into the bakery box and handed me a folded envelope. Richard asked me to bring this. Inside was a copy of the board's final resolution, signed by every director. The new policy required original recorded plats for all future construction, mandatory verification of survey monuments before excavation, and permanent preservation of both the developer's letter and the obsolete maintenance map for future boards. At the bottom was one final paragraph. The board acknowledges that neighboring property owner Daniel Harper's boundary notice prompted the verification that prevented construction beyond the association's legal boundary. I looked up. You didn't have to include that. Karen smiled. Actually, we did. A week later, the entrance project was finished. The new stone wall looked exactly as the architect had imagined it. The landscaping was beautiful. The lighting came on every evening without a single fixture crossing the property line. Unless someone knew the story, they'd never guess how close the neighborhood had come to building it in the wrong place. Something else changed too. Homeowners who used to drive past my property without looking now waved. A few even stopped to ask about the brass survey monument that had quietly settled the entire dispute. Susan joked that the smallest object in the neighborhood had turned out to be the most important one. Michael laughed and said someone should put up another sign beside it reading, "The only board member that was always right." Even Richard laughed at that. Several months later, I was walking the property when I noticed a moving truck parked outside one of the houses near the entrance. A young couple had just purchased their first home in the neighborhood. As I passed, the husband pointed toward the stone entrance and asked one of his new neighbors, "What's that sign over there for?" Before I could answer, Susan smiled. "That's a long story." Michael grinned. Short version. He pointed toward my property. The HOA almost built half that entrance on the wrong land. The young couple looked surprised. Seriously? Richard happened to be walking by and overheard the conversation. He smiled. Almost. The husband looked toward the beautifully finished entrance. What stopped it? Richard glanced across the road at my weathered warning sign, then down at the brass survey monument sitting quietly beside it. Someone who cared more about getting it right than about winning an argument. He looked at me and gave a small nod before continuing on his walk. I stood there for another moment, watching children ride bicycles past the entrance, completely unaware of the story beneath their tires. The stone wall would probably stand there for decades. So would the survey monument. One represented what people built. The other represented what people should have checked before building it. Looking back, the most satisfying part of the entire experience wasn't proving I was right. It wasn't hearing an apology. It wasn't watching the board rewrite its policies. It was knowing that one quiet question, asked before the first shovel entered the ground, saved an entire neighborhood from years of unnecessary conflict. Because confidence can be mistaken. Assumptions can be inherited. Maps can be copied incorrectly. But ownership doesn't change simply because enough people repeat the same story. In the end, the HOA didn't lose because a homeowner challenged its authority. It lost because it underestimated the one thing that never needs to raise its voice to win. The truth, patiently waiting exactly where the property line had always been.